Good morning and welcome everyone to today's webinar, Reducing Scope 3 Emissions, Purchased Goods and Services. Today's webinar is hosted by the UN Global Compact Network UK. This is the first webinar we're planning in a series to support companies to reduce emissions across their value chains. Each webinar will take a focused look at key Scope 3 emissions categories as defined in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And for this webinar, we are looking at category 1, purchased goods and services. So really appreciate you all joining today and taking time to learn more about this very important topic. So just a quick housekeeping before we move on. This is a 30-minute webinar. It is being recorded and this recording will be sent to you afterwards. I do ask that you keep your microphones muted throughout. And we will have time for questions at the end of this webinar, so please feel free to input any questions into the chat box at any time. So my name is Amy Collins and I lead our climate action programme here at the UN Global Compact Network UK. And I am very pleased to be joined today by Dorothée D'Herde, who leads Sustainable Business at Vodafone Group. The Sustainable Business team supports the delivery of Vodafone's purpose agenda and contribution to the SDGs, as well as ensuring sound, responsible business practices and transparent reporting. Dorothée took up the role at Vodafone last year after 10 years at McKinsey & Company, where she most recently was Director of Sustainability and Social Impact. She is also a trustee at Earthwatch Europe. So really delighted for her to join us today, and she has kindly agreed to share Vodafone's experience and approach to reducing their purchased goods and services Scope 3 emissions. So briefly, for those of you who are not familiar with the UN Global Compact, it is the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. We have over 12,000 businesses and around 3,000 non-businesses participating. It was launched 20 years ago to establish universal values among businesses around the world. And basically, we ask companies to align their operations and strategies with 10 universally accepted principles in the areas of human rights, labour, environment, and anti-corruption. And predominantly, we drive business awareness and action to support achievement of the UN SDGs. So today, the UN Global Compact has networks in around 68 countries who help to support at the local level as well as at the global level. Here in the UK, we organise a range of events and activities to support the 10 principles, and specifically we have programs on the global goals, business and human rights, and climate action. So, as mentioned, this webinar is part of a series that we're planning to host on Scope 3 emissions. Each one is looking at a key Scope 3 emissions category as defined in the GHG Protocol. So we might not be able to get to all your answers today, but we do want to raise awareness of Scope 3 emissions and their importance. And we also want to help you to start to understand, identify and assess, and how to reduce purchased goods and services emissions. And we'll be doing that by sharing best practice from a leading company in this area. So just very briefly, before I hand over to Dorothée. So what are Scope 3 emissions and why are they important? So the GHG Protocol breaks down the scope of emissions into 3 parts. Scope 3 emissions are defined as all indirect emissions that occur in the value chain of a company. So as seen on this slide, on the right-hand side, Scope 3 emissions are then broken down into 15 subcategories and into upstream and downstream emissions. And in short, so category 1, purchased goods and services, which is the focus of today's webinar. These are emissions that come from the life cycle of goods and services. So thinking about the extraction, production and transportation. Then that a company purchases or acquires. So they can include products that are used to transform another product, final products for resale, capital goods, products that are actually used within the company's office, such as desks, computers, etc., or products used for maintenance as well. So out of all the 15 subcategories that the GHG Protocol defines, purchased goods and services tends to have the largest impact because it is relevant for so many companies across many sectors. And for many companies, Scope 3 emissions represent the greatest source of their total emissions. So in a lot of cases, 80% or more of a company's emissions can come from the value chain. So this does present companies with a significant opportunity to influence their emissions reductions, and it is why it's so important for these emissions to be considered. Yet, Scope 3 emissions are often overlooked and underreported. And it's also important to consider when you're thinking about setting targets such as net zero or science-based targets, which a lot of companies are now doing or looked to do so. These emissions need to be addressed when setting those targets. And of course, there are numerous benefits for companies associated with measuring and reducing their Scope 3 emissions, such as cost savings, to build resilience, and an improved internal and public image. But because essentially they are emissions from sources that a company does not own or control, they can present the greatest challenge to reduce. So on that note, I'm very pleased to welcome Dorothée and hand over to her to elaborate more on this topic and share her insights from Vodafone. So Dorothée, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Amy, and good morning everyone from London. I'm very pleased to be here today, and I hope you all have a cup of tea or coffee and are ready to dive into Scope 3 emissions, and more specifically within that 15 category rich territory of indirect emissions, the emissions from supply chain or other purchased goods and services. And it's an area where really we can jointly make a huge amount of progress towards decarbonization. So let me set some Vodafone context first. Amy, if you don't mind going to the next slide, or Robert, whoever is doing it. We've long been committed to being a sustainable and responsible business, and we first published our carbon data and a sustainability report in 2001. And this, of course, as is the case for most companies, only included Scope 1 and 2 emissions, so the direct emissions from our operations, apart from some minimal Scope 3 emissions related to business travel, which are quite easy to measure and also to control. And Scope 3 really remained a relatively unknown and obscure territory, which is outside of our direct control until 2016, when we did our first scoping exercise to really fully assess all of the 15 categories of Scope 3 and determine which ones are material for us. And I don't know where each of you are on in with regards to their journey, but that is really the first essential step, to do that scoping exercise and see what is material. And in this case, anything over 1% is big and is material. So that's it looks like a small number, but still anything over 1% is material and therefore should be measured and be included. And also the things where you really have a lot of influenceability over the reductions. We also, on the other hand, have a long history of engaging with our supply chain, whether it's through directly talking to our suppliers, through our engagement with CDP, through the supply chain module, which we were a founding member of 10 years ago. And all of these things, if I can have the next slide, please, are part of our planet agenda. And our planet agenda is really very much part of our purpose agenda. Our purpose is connecting for a better future and really building a digital society that is resilient, that is inclusive, and that is sustainable. This agenda is led by our CEO, Nick Reed, and is cultivated really throughout the company. So every single function, OpCo has a purpose strategy and adheres to these planet targets. And all of our targets are global targets. As you may know, we operate mobile and fixed networks in 22 countries across Europe and Africa. And where we can, we accelerate the targets in specific regions. For example, our 100% renewable electricity target by 2025, we have committed to accelerating that for a European footprint and get there by July 2021. All of our targets are aligned to a 1.5 degree warming world, or maximum 1.5 degree, and the short-term targets really focus on what we can address at scale within our direct impact. Now we're also building our longer term goals, and we have submitted a science-based target for approval to the SBTi, so watch this space. Obviously that will also include a target around scope 3 emissions. And to do that, so for our SBT, we used the pathway that had specifically been developed for the ICT sector, so a sector-specific pathway developed by GSMA, to make sure that the reductions that we're looking at are really in line with what our industry needs to achieve. And it's quite an important point to kind of look at what you need to do as an industry, because that gives you much more specific details on what is required also on scope 3, etc. Apart from that, just to round off, for me, the big prize is obviously the enablement target, so the 350 million tons of CO2 that you see there. This is about helping the world decarbonize to the extent of 350 million tons between now and 2030. And that happens mainly through smart meters, fleet logistics, etc. And that's, by the way, the annual emissions of the UK, so quite a sizable amount. So that's just to put a picture, a broader picture of where we are at Vodafone and what we have committed to. You also see there's commitments around e-waste, where we have been working on reducing, or rather making sure that 100% of our network waste is reused, resold and recycled, and we're now also looking at device waste. So if I can have the next slide, diving into scope 3. So as Amy mentioned, scope 3 for many companies is quite a big chunk of their overall footprint. For us, it's 87% of our total carbon footprint, or almost 12 million tons of CO2 last year. And of course, the share of scope 3 within the overall footprint will increase because we will be faster in reducing our scope 1 and 2 emissions. So that relative share will increase. So within the scope 3, purchased goods and services account for 31% of the scope 3, so around 3.5 million tons. And as Amy mentioned again, purchased goods and services includes all upstream emissions from the production of the products that we purchase, for example, phones. And this is called cradle to gate. So it's an assessment of a partial product life cycle. So from the resource extraction, the cradle, to the factory or the gate, so before it transported to consumers. And I wanted to flag that because the electricity that you use afterwards when you've bought the phone and to charge your phone at home does not fit in this category of scope 3. That would sit under the use of sold products, where I'm sure Amy is organizing a webinar on that one too, so you'll hear more about that soon. Just to complete the picture, so apart from our use of goods, the purchased goods and services, we also have use of goods, of sold goods, and we have investments. The investment is really high in our case because of the size and the scale of our joint venture in India in Vodafone Idea. So that's a large country, obviously, with still a high carbon grid. So investments for us is the biggest category, and then also obviously the purchased goods and services and the use of sold goods. Just a little aside, just to highlight the importance of really measuring the footprint across all of those 3 categories and scopes is, so India used to be within our management control. So it used to be in scope 1 and 2, and then suddenly when we didn't own the majority anymore, it moved into scope 3. So there's, it's sometimes quite a lot of flux. So it's important to have that full picture so that you can also see those moving pieces. Also thinking, for example, now with COVID, a lot more people are working from home. So the whole, the emissions from staff commuting, etc., there's a lot of shifting there as well. So back to our supply chain. Our supply chain spend is annually about 22 billion euro. And that's more or less equally distributed between devices, network equipment, IT, and then kind of other, so commercial services, agencies, etc. Let me talk first about how we measure it and then how we address it. And measurement is really important because a lot of what you can do in terms of how you address it really depends on how you measure it in the first place. And measurement is also where the challenges already start. So, challenges. One, we have a huge amount of suppliers in many different categories. We also have many people throughout the organization who engage with those suppliers, whether it's the people in supply chain, in technology, in commercial, in sustainable business, etc. So it's not even always easy for us to know who to ask for data from. And those people might not have the data. Secondly, or thirdly, even it's sometimes really resource intensive to get the data. So even if there is data out there, just imagine the resources required to go out to all of your thousands of suppliers to actually extract that information. So even when it's there, it's not necessarily that easy to get it. And then, of course, this is an emerging field. So there's a lot of work still needed to be done on the, to understand the ins and outs and really get our head around it. So what we try to do is be as precise as possible. But in reality, that's not very precise at all, because there's a lot of room for improvement. So what it looks like is this. So 30% more or less of our supply chain emissions, so our purchased goods and services, are from handsets. And there we have quite a good overview of what we sell and what the hotspots are, i.e. what are the big chunks and the kind of the types of handset where there's really a considerable volume. So as an example, so Apple is a hotspot, so the iPhones obviously, and Apple also have good life cycle assessments for each of the models of their iPhones, which take into account where the phones have produced, etc. So we can use a part of that life cycle assessment, or LCA, to look at the emissions within our category of purchased goods and services. I say a part because a life cycle assessment usually, as it says, looks at the whole life cycle. And as I mentioned before, the part that is the kind of the use of the phone, so the charging of the phone in your house, is not really covered in this category of the Scope 3 emissions. So we take the part of the LCA that is relevant, and then you multiply it by the number of sales of a particular product, and you've got the carbon footprint of that kind of piece. So for the hotspots, we do it kind of on a model by model basis. For like other sets of handsets, we use kind of a blended average. So all the types of mid-range phones that have vaguely been produced in the same way, we use an average kind of approach, and then also again multiply by the number of sales. So that's about the 30% more or less. So that's quite specific. For the other 70%, we use a spend-based methodology. So this means that per category, you look at the spend in each of these procurement categories, and then you apply an EEIO emission factor. And so EEIO, and now I'm going to try to get this right, is the environmentally extended input output. Quite a mouthful. But I don't, it's not quite intuitive, this concept, but it's a method to evaluate the link between the economic consumption activities and the environmental impact. So basically, it's used to evaluate the environmental impact embodied in the goods and services that are traded between nations. And these EEIO factors are reviewed annually and actually have gone down quite a lot. So they went down approximately 40% between 2002 and 2016. So there's a kind of, as grids are decarbonizing, etc., that kind of gets filtered into those factors, and therefore gets filtered into your calculations. So it's a good place to start, but quite generic for very broad categories. And we're really looking to move into much more granular data. One way to do that is through the CDP supply chain program, where there's also room for improvement still, and not all of the suppliers are giving the kind of specificity of the data that is needed. There's obviously the LCAs, the life cycle assessments, where lots more companies are now really starting to look into those, and more data is getting available. And then there's a lot more to do also with GSMA and in an industry context. Now, moving into the actual reductions, if you don't mind going to the next slide. Let me start by saying that for Scope 3, there is a lot that will be done for you. So obviously, seeing the numbers, the volumes of emissions and the kind of the scale of the challenge is quite overwhelming. It's really daunting, especially to some extent because they're outside of your control. So you have this like, whoa, it's so huge and I don't know what to do about it. And I don't know that I can control to actually get there. But so rest assured, to some extent, a lot is happening for you. Because after all, obviously, if every single company addresses its Scope 1 and 2 emissions, our Scope 3 emissions will be addressed by definition or by implication. But even at a broader level. So first of all, obviously, there's a global decarbonization that is happening. Lots of countries are switching their grid to renewables, have made commitments to net zero, and the big news from Climate Week was that last week, the week before? I can't even remember. Was China committing to being net zero by 2060. So that's a big deal. And then obviously the emissions from the electricity that is needed to produce those goods and services, etc., will go down. And that should get us probably maybe even a third of the way there. Add on to that, obviously, the pressure of investors, the cost parity of renewable energy, etc., etc. Second big one is most large companies are setting targets. So most of our large suppliers that account for quite a fair chunk of our supply chain are setting science-based targets or very ambitious targets themselves. Apple will be carbon neutral by 2030 for its supply chain. Microsoft is committed to being carbon negative. Samsung is setting a new target next year, which will very likely be an ambitious target. So a large share of our supply chain emissions obviously will be taken care of by their SBTs. And then lastly, obviously, data and assessment methods are improving. As I mentioned, that EEIO factor has gone down quite a lot over the years. So that's the kind of the passive reductions. That's the kind of the bit that is taken care of for you, that is outside of your control. But then to move to the active, because whilst it's outside of our control, it's inside our sphere of influence. So we need to leverage our power as companies to actually drive improvements in our supply chain. There's a huge potential to work as industry. So we do a lot of work with GSMA to make sure that similar targets are set across the industry, that we work with our suppliers, that we leverage the power of the CDP supply chain elements. Also that we audit suppliers jointly. So we have the joint audit corporation, which is a group of telcos jointly auditing suppliers. So initially it was on human rights issues, etc. Now also there's an environmental element that is included. So there's a lot of things that you can do as an industry. And then we have our own actions as Vodafone. And there, as I mentioned up front, the levers or the measures that you can take to reduce really depend on what you've measured in the first place. Because obviously, if you only have a kind of spend-based data or assessment, then the only thing you can really do is reduce your spend, so buy less. That's the only lever you have then to kind of within your power to reduce the emissions. But obviously, there's a lot more we can do. So just to talk you through a few things as we take a full life cycle approach that we think of and that we do with our suppliers. First of all, already at the stage of selection, maybe some of you saw that last week or the week before, I'm losing completely track of time, we announced that from this month, so from October, 20% of the assessment of vendors in a request for quotations process will be based on their commitment and targets around the environment and inclusion and diversity. So upfront at the vendor selection stage, there is a priority or a kind of preference for suppliers that have set environmental targets, etc. So that's already at the selection stage where you obviously also, for example, can look at the geographical spread of your suppliers and kind of make sure that they sit in countries that have more decarbonized grids. Next step in the kind of life cycle, onboarding. So, you know, that's anything from making sure that in the contracts you have clauses around environmental performance, but also, for example, you know, contractually asking for life cycle assessment information and asking to make that available. We also check when we onboard our suppliers that they have the right environmental policies, etc., in place. So that's the onboarding. We've selected them, we've onboarded them, then it's kind of the continuous, you know, the working together, right? So the continuous assessments and audits and rewards. So as I mentioned, our biggest suppliers are all part of the CDP supply chain program, where there's lots of questions around the targets that they've set, renewable energy, greenhouse gas emission reduction, and also even the carbon emissions for the service that they give to a particular company. We have reward systems, so for the companies that do best under those programs, so it's a bit of carrot and stick, obviously. I mentioned the JAC audits as well. Then we encourage our suppliers to set SBTs. Now, obviously, you know, given that I mentioned that we have a huge number of suppliers, that's not always easy to kind of track and ensure the compliance with that, but at least for the big ones, that is definitely something we can do. We're also working within a consortium to develop a new way to keep consumers involved of the device performance. So that obviously also then sends a signal to suppliers as well to reduce or improve the energy efficiency of their devices, etc. We can drive green packaging, so we're working with our supply chain to drive greener packaging, to cut out plastics. We reduced the size of the SIM card holder by half so that it's only half of the plastic, etc., etc. And then just very specifically SMEs, because that's come up very often also as a theme. So obviously the biggest suppliers are the big chunk of the emissions, but then there's a long tail, and obviously for the smaller companies, it's often, you know, harder to get their head around all of the mandatory and voluntary things that they can do, and to kind of, you know, they often lack the support to do that. So that's become more and more a topic. And for example, at the Climate Week, there was the launch of an SME Climate Hub, which will support SMEs specifically to set targets. You can also get really inventive. So one of the things that one could do is you know, when you purchase renewable electricity under a PPA, to buy a bit extra and kind of sell it on to this SME so that they can kind of benefit also from that PPA and from renewable electricity. So there's lots more things that can be done. And ultimately, you know, there's a lot that we can do together, right, in this space, which is the beauty of this category, I guess, of the Scope 3. And the more of us set targets, the more of us take action, we will get there jointly. So it kind of becomes a win-win for everyone and for the planet. Now, I see we're nearly at time, which was not the idea, but I do have time for a few questions. And I also have invited my amazing colleague, Andy, along so that everything that I can't answer, he can answer. Amy, back to you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That was a really, really good overview, very detailed. Great to hear about all of the support that you offer your suppliers in the onboarding process as well. You have answered a lot of questions that I had already wanted to ask you, but we've got a few questions that have come into the chat that hopefully I can just quickly put in there.
Sure.
So I guess one of the main challenges around Scope 3 emissions is around double counting.
Mm-hmm.
So how have you tried to avoid that?
That's a very good question. I'll hand over to Andy in a second, but one of the things that I must say that we work with the Carbon Trust to help us with this. So we do get real deep experts involved in helping us with this. But Andy, do you want to dig a bit deeper if you're on?
Yes, hi, hopefully you can hear and see me. Yeah, double counting. I am assuming this is double counting between your Scope 1, 2, and 3. The way the GHG Protocol is set out is very clear and concise to avoid double counting, which is why you do have to break your emissions quite carefully into your correct scopes. I guess the idea is that multiple people can share the same scope 3 emissions, but the fact that if we all have targets and we all push a reduction in our scope 3, especially in kind of a shared approach, we will all reach that point, and everyone's scope 3 is someone else's scope 1 and 2. So as everyone reduces their scope 1 and 2 to 0, all of our collective scope 3s also go to 0. So, and this is why you need to be careful on how you set your targets and how you analyze and report them. So yeah, so two companies could be looking at a very similar kind of scope 3, but as long as that company who owns that scope 3 is reducing it through their scope 1 and 2, you can get to a point of low to 0 carbon in a aggregated fashion across the world. I hope that makes sense.
Great, thank you, Andy. Just another quick question. So do you have any ideas on how we could collaborate, or how you could collaborate across industries in the area of scope 3 reduction?
Yes, I mean, I think a lot of that is already happening, right? So all we do with suppliers is to some extent across industries, because obviously we've got suppliers in IT, but then also professional services, law firms, et cetera, where, you know, we help by making requirements from them. So that very often for the sustainability people within those companies is the push that they need to be able to take the proposals to their leaders. We convened them as well. We held supplier workshops to ask them, okay, what is most useful? How can we work together, etc. You know, so that not every single company you work for or you supply to asks you for different things. How can we standardize this? You know, working through GSMA and through GSMA with other sectors is a good approach as well. Don't know, Andy, do you want to add anything else?
I mean, using things like science-based targets and following a set methodology, which has a very distinct pathway of reduction. For example, we have a new ITC pathway, which means everyone in the industry, if they follow that, whether it's upchain or downchain, have the same minimum requirements to reach a 1.5 degree world, means that we support each other in a consistent way, which therefore means you're not all giving different timescales or levels of reduction, which then confuse and add challenge. And if everyone's given a same consistent message, it really supports each other to pass everything along the chain and really work together in an aggregate fashion.
Thank you both. And just one final question. So you spoke quite a bit about the support you provide to your suppliers and around the rewards scheme as well. I was just wondering if we could have a bit more information or detail on that rewards scheme. So what is the carrot that you offer to suppliers?
A carrot. Andy, do you want to tackle the carrot? Or I'll hit you with a stick.
And it does vary. I mean, there is the quite simple approach of assessing, giving feedback, giving support, giving information that they can use to improve year on year, and then providing almost an awards process. So you really recognize and publicly give that recognition to companies that are doing the best, so they get the feedback that they need, and then they also are incentivized through showing that they are valued to us, and therefore they can you know, they're an important supplier. And this then feeds again into the RFQ process. So if they're scoring well and have shown to do that, they will rate higher on our supplier RFQs, so we're more likely to then spend more money with them. And then if you kind of go beyond that kind of level of engagement, there's also things you can do around your finance, especially if you look into kind of SMEs, be it preferential payment terms. So, you know, maybe you pay them quicker if they're a preferred supplier who have reached a certain level of standard, and you give them a better level of treatment because you recognize that you're both working together.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Well, I am very sad that we've run out of time because there are a few more questions, but hopefully we'll get to those questions in some of the other activities that we have coming up around Scope 3 emissions. But I just want to say thank you very much, Dorothée, for joining us, and Andy for your answers to some of those questions there. It was a really great presentation and fantastic to hear about the approach and the journey that you've been on. So yeah, as I just mentioned, we have got a few other Scope 3 events coming up. So do just check out our website, UN Global Compact Network UK website, if you are interested in joining them. So thank you everyone for attending today, and thank you, Dorothée, again, and look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thank you very much for inviting us.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.